Chapter 2 of Hunters Out of Space. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elliot Miller. Hunters Out of Space by Joseph E. Kelleam. Chapter 2.
Jack Odin descended into the cavern, or what Keefe had called the hole, for less than 100 yards before his strong flashlight sent its lancing beam into a stone wall. At his feet was a crevice which went straight down, as though it had been measured by a giant square. He got to his knees and looked over. Playing his light around, he detected a few ledges like narrow steps far below. It was pitch dark down there, and not even his strong light could reach to the bottom. He tried tossing a few pebbles into it. Listening, he heard the faint rattle of their fall, but could not be sure whether they had landed on one of the ledges or had reached bottom. Looking around him, he found a weathered bit of limestone that thrust itself up like a small table. It did not look very substantial, but it was his only hope. Odin had crammed his ammunition, food, and canteen into a knapsack. Looping the rope through it and his rifle strap, he lowered them over until he felt the rope slacken as his gun and supplies rested upon the first ledge. Releasing one end of the rope, he carefully drew it back. Now he knotted the rope about the stone and let the two lengths of it trail down towards the ledge. He had kept his flashlight, which he thrust into his belt. One other thing, a little miner's cap and light, now came into use. It was warm down there, and as soon as the cap with its lighted lamp was on his head, sweat began to pour down his neck. Suddenly he remembered a scene he had witnessed one morning in West Virginia, so long ago that it should have been forgotten. His car had stalled in a tiny town one evening. He had slept in the only hotel, but he had got up before daybreak so he could start an early search for a mechanic. Looking up toward the hills, he had seen a silent procession of lights going upward to some unknown mine. There was something grotesque about those climbing lights. The identity of the men was lost, and this was a crawling thing up there on the hillside. For a moment he felt himself feeling infinite pity for all the men everywhere who spent their days in the dark. Then he laughed. Better feel a bit sorry for Jack Odin, too. Getting ready to lower himself over a precipice, and not having the slightest idea when he would reach bottom, or whether there was any bottom at all. The blackness beat at the little light. A startled bat left its upside-down perch and fluttered against his face, clicking its teeth in warning. Well, he could stay here and think until doomsday, so with a shrug of his big shoulders, he got a firm grip on the doubled rope and slid over the edge. He went down and down until his shoulders ached. Once he got his feet down on an outcropping, but dared not brace himself there for fear of loosening his rope with its unsteady mooring above. Then at last he came to the ledge with only a few feet of his doubled rope to spare. After resting the little cap and lamp in a secure cranny, he lay flat on his stomach for a few minutes, gulping great draughts of air and trying to rub some feeling back into his aching shoulders. Then he got up and started looking around for some anchorage. Some 20 feet away he found a little spur of rock. The second ledge was negotiated in the same fashion as the first. It was scarcely 4 feet in width. Leaning over it, with his powerful flashlight spraying a beam of light downward, he saw that there were no more ledges between him and the floor of the crevice below. Not even a single outcropping. The wall was smooth and glassy, as though at one time for ages and ages water had flown down it and had left a glossy coating upon its face. Moreover, when he awkwardly dangled his rope into the abyss with one hand and kept his light upon it with the other, he found to his disappointment that not even a single length would reach to the dimly seen floor below. He sat there for a while, chewing at a bit of jerked beef, trying to get his strength back, racking his brains for a plan. But he could think of nothing except getting back to Opal. Then, at last, with a sigh and maybe a curse at the things that happened and maybe a bit of prayer, he began to tie a loop, lasso fashion, into his rope. Finding another spur of rock became a problem. This ledge was smooth. But in time he found one and drew his loop tightly about it. Rolling the knapsack up into a ball and tying it securely, he threw it over the brink. Listening, he heard it land and bounce 2 or 3 times. The gun was slung over his shoulder. The miner's cap and lamp went back on his head. He stuffed his pockets full of ammunition and slid over the edge. Once, he nearly lost his grip on the single strand and slid downward for a yard or two with the rough coils taking the hide off his palms. But he held on, and at last he was dangling at the end of the rope like a plumb bob. Carefully, he tightened his grip with the right hand and let go with his left. His shoulder creaked, and fangs of pain struck at his wrist and elbow. But he hung on. Playing the flashlight below him, he saw that the floor of the crevice was still many yards away. It seemed to be of sand, but he was not sure. Limestone could be deceiving. Putting the light back in his belt, he began feeling along the wall. It was smooth. Finally, reaching down as far as he could, he found a little hole scarcely large enough for one hand. There was no time left to consider. Getting his fingers into it, he turned loose of the rope and dropped down. It felt as though his left shoulder was tearing loose, but he held his grip. Kicking about, he found a toehold in the wall, and finally another grip for his hand. In this way, Odin went down for nearly a dozen yards, but at last he could find neither a grip for his hands nor a rest for his feet. He did not care now. The pain in his shoulders was becoming unbearable. Taking one great gulp of air, he released his hold on the wall and thrust his body out into space. The little light in his cap went out. Odin fell through darkness. He fell into soft sand, doubling up as his feet touched it. Odin rolled over and over, losing both flashlight and gun as he tumbled. Then he came up against hard rock, with most of the wind knocked out of him, and lay there gasping, feeling about him with frantic hands for the light and the gun. The old terror of the dark swept over him as he clutched this way and that and found nothing. Then he got a grip on himself and laughed at his fears, remembering that he had matches in his pockets. The spurt of a match showed him that his miner's cap was not 5 feet away. He must have missed it by inches as he was clutching about in the dark. He lit it and soon found gun and flash. Pointing his light upward, he could faintly see the knotted end of his rope swinging back and forth there up against the precipice. It was his only link with the outside world, and it was far out of reach. He shrugged and played the light about the cavern into which he had ventured. The walls of the crevice into which he had fallen were never over 10 feet apart and in spots were less than 3. But the sandy bed sloped noticeably downward, so downward he went, only pausing occasionally to take a mouthful of water from his canteen or eat a bite or two. His watch had been broken in that last fall and he threw it away. The air grew hotter. So hot at last that Odin had to pause more often and rest upon the sand. But it was too hot, as though it had never known anything but this one temperature. Stumbling along, his nostrils and chest burning, and something thumping in his ears, he finally fell to his knees. Jack Odin lay there for a long time, but the floor of the cavern still led downward, so with nothing else left in his mind, he got to his knees and crawled on. That last determination saved him. A cool breath of air struck him in the face. He toiled downward and was soon in a wider cavern that was so cold he was shivering. He rested again and then went on. The cold grew worse. Odin came to a tunnel of ice. The faint smell of ammonia set him to coughing. It was nearly as uncomfortable here as the heat had been a few hours before. But he kept on. Finally, there was no ice left on the walls about him, and the air grew warmer. Soon the walls opened out until he could scarcely see them with his flashlight. Playing it upward, he could only get a faint reflection from the stalactites hundreds of feet away. At length Odin came to a vast room where his light could neither reach walls nor ceiling. But in the center of it was a tiny pool, rimmed by white sand, and a shell-like lip of limestone. He got to his knees and tested the water. It was clean, but old and old and old. Filling his canteen, he opened his knapsack and prepared a hearty meal. He was dog-tired, but before he slept he walked around the little pool. He had heard of fish being found in underground caverns, or even the fossils of things that had once been there. But here Odin found no sign of life, nothing except traces of the vast underground river that must have once swept through here long ago. It was a desolate feeling to stand there with his beam of light pushing the dark away, alone in a place which apparently had never known the beat of life before. And then Odin saw it. A footprint. A small footprint which he must have been made by someone who wore moccasins or sandals. He recognized it at once. He had seen hundreds of those footprints. A Neebling had been there. How long before he did not know, but certainly Odin's theory had been right. The cavern led the way to Opal. Jack Odin was not sure how many times he ate and slept as he toiled his way downward. The long dead river had carved cunningly and beautifully upon the walls of the tunnel, and the dripping waters of centuries had fashioned pedestals, carvings, and statues that were beautiful indeed. Ordinarily, he would have been interested in these, for Jack Odin was a man who loved beautiful things. But now he had but one idea: to go on. Occasionally, he found more footprints, but always near the scattered pools. The dwarves must have kept against the walls and come out upon the sand only to quench their thirst. He wondered about that, and a possible answer came to him. They had been there without a light, feeling their way, almost, although he knew that they could see in the dark to a certain extent. He wondered at their courage. Here, with two lights, the staring darkness, and the silent empty spaces were making him shaky. The descent became sharper. At times he slid down long grades of limestone. Now and then he came to sharp drops where little waterfalls had once been. But there was usually sand below and he was able to leap down without much harm, other than a jolt or two. But once he came to one of those drops that must have measured 100 feet. He found a few rocky steps where the little precipice met the wall and clambered down, but it was rough going, and he had to make a jump for it at the last. Picking himself up and dusting the sand from his clothes, he thought he saw a white gleam over against the wall. His light found a squat skeleton sitting there grimacing at him. He touched the skull and it fell to powder. Here was one of the dwarves, a Neebling, but the bones did not belong to this age. The poor fellow must have lain there for centuries. Dr. Jack Odin was never able to get all of his medical training out of his mind. Examining the skeleton, he found that both legs had been broken. Apparently, the little man had been climbing up or down the precipice Odin had just negotiated and had slipped and fallen. His leg shattered, and infection setting in, the Neebling had crawled against the wall to die. Odin could have imagined him doing the last task silently. They were akin to the animals that they loved, the Neeblings. They did not complain. Hours and hours later, as Odin toiled his way downward, he became aware of a growing stench in the stale air. Even this was welcome, for he was becoming obsessed with the idea that the cavern had not changed since the long ago river had died, and that nothing in it could change. It was an odor of rottenness. Where there was decay, life had also been. By the time he reached the next pool, the putrescence which hung on the stale air was almost sickening. There he made his second discovery. A saurian of some sort, with squat legs and long fanged mouth, had died there. Half decayed, it made a little phosphor glowing in the dark, and its long teeth flashed as he played a beam of light over it. Noisome as it was, the sight of it made his heart quicken, for here was one of the things of Opal. It must have crawled up here from that silent sea. Then a feeling of gloom and dread swept over him. What had happened down there to make this thing leave its home and crawl here to die? Odin went on and on, the smell of the thing behind him slowly fading from the air. Then, as he rounded a corner, Odin blinked his eyes. Far ahead of him was a red glow. Taking a deep breath, he thought he smelled smoke. Or was it sulfur? He had never been able to get one grim possibility out of his mind. What if some of the fires and lava streams of inner earth should lie between him and the world of Opal? He had gone too far to turn back, so Odin went on cautiously. As he neared the red glow, he saw that it was only a campfire dying down to coals. But from the darkness came such a clamoring of hisses, groans, and screeches that he could feel goose pimples popping out on his arms. His rifle held a clamp for his flash. Making gun and light ready, he advanced cautiously, still unable to determine what was happening except that one hell of a fight was going on. Then a coal burst into quick flame and he could see the struggle. A broad-shouldered man, stripped to the waist, was fighting with one of the saurians. He had closed its long mouth with a huge hand and was striking again and again at the white throat with a broad-bladed knife. The thing was screeching and clawing at the man's arm. Its razored tail was lashing forward, and the man was dodging it as he kept backing in a circle and thrusting the head upward and backwards. Both brute and man were streaming blood. The man made no sound other than an occasional savage grunt as his blade struck deep through the horny hide of the thing. The saurian became wilder with each blow. It was a long shot, but Jack Odin made it. Both man and reptile quickened into momentary stone as his light centered its beam upon them. Odin aimed and fired. The heavy bullet shattered the top of the saurian's head. Then Odin was running forward, calling out in the language of Opal. The broad-shouldered man kicked the wriggling carcass of the thing out of the way and threw a few sticks upon the coals. They flamed up. The man sat down calmly, though still gasping for breath, and began to wipe the blade of his knife upon his thigh. He had regained some of his breath when Odin reached him. Rubbing a gashed forearm and smiling as though such a meeting were an everyday occurrence, he called out cheerfully, "Ho, Nose King! I knew you would come. Sooner or later you would be here and we would go hunting together." The man was Gunnar, successor to Jul and chief of the Neeblings. End of chapter 2.